Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, Rosie. Both of us, Todd and I, would like to thank Fahar for allowing us this opportunity to join you this morning through a very interesting and appealing, and if I may say, trending topic, which is evolving employee engagement to create a remarkable employee experience. I'd like to thank the Fahar team for this opportunity, and I hope that the session will be beneficial for you all. For today, the speaker is, as I mentioned, Dr. Todd Brody. Dr. Todd Brody is a senior subject matter expert and faculty at Talent at Work, but he is also vice president for a very large public health organization back in the US, Centurion, who's part of a top 25 company from Fortune 500 companies. So I'm very honored and glad to have you with me this morning, Todd.
Gael, and thank you very much for having me today. I too am so excited to be here and joining the Fahar team once again to share, I think, some exciting information, as we take a look at what truly an employee experience means. As I thought about this presentation and as we kind of begin our discussion today, there's just a few things that I wanted to make sure that we shared. As you have questions or you'd like additional information, please feel free to share your questions in the chat feature, and we will do our best to answer questions as they come up, and we'll hopefully save some time at the very end to also answer questions as well. But as I think about kind of employee engagement and employee experience, I think there's something to really not only be excited about, but really to help us better understand what we're trying to accomplish and what we're trying to do. Because as we look at trying to optimize the employee experience, that truly will be a top priority for all businesses around the world for the remainder of this year and well into 2023 and beyond. One of the things as we take a look at kind of what's been happening all around the world in the last 12 to 14 to 16 months, we've had millions of people around the world leave their jobs really in hopes of finding better and more interesting opportunities. And many have yet to return to the workforce. And, we continue to see, people suggest that we're going to see another wave of resignations in 2023 as well. So it'll be interesting to see if that actually plays out. But one of the things that we also recognize, I think, is as HR professionals, we're still trying to figure out how to navigate this ever changing landscape. We've had COVID, we've had health and safety protocols we've had to put in place, and those are constantly changing. And we see a further complication of kind of how do we manage our workforce on site because of this dynamic change that we continue to see. One of the things that we also have to pay attention to, given these dynamics, is that HR departments truly have a difficult task ahead in keeping our workforce engaged without creating any risk for our organizations overall. Because when we really take a look at it, employees want to feel supported and challenged at work, yet companies can't neglect kind of the obligations that we have or we've had during this public health crisis. And we have to try and figure out what is that right balance to help us enable employee success. As we start to take a look at some interesting insight as we start to think about how to evolve employee engagement to truly create this remarkable employee experience. Many times we start to about how do we just engage employees better in our traditional workplace. But do we have to start looking beyond what we've been doing in the past? And it's really interesting that many people are looking for different things than what they've historically wanted to take a look at to engage themselves. Maybe it's hybrid work, or maybe it's fully remote working, or maybe there's something else that employees are looking for, and truly it becomes up to us to understand kind of what that looks like and what that is. And as we start to uncover what that means, these are truly investments, and I think we have to think about kind of investing in our employee experience in the future to enable worker success and ultimately retain key people who would otherwise perhaps explore new opportunities. I think one of the good news pieces though is that it's keeping workers satisfied that does more than prevent really turnover. It also creates value in a number of different ways. And that's what we're going to take a look at talking about during our time together today. So once again, I'm so excited to be here with you. So I thought we might start off by taking a look at perhaps a question to really get us thinking about kind of employee engagement and really understanding engagement and experience. So, as you take a look at the question on the screen here, what does employee experience mean to you? And do you think it's the same or different from employee engagement? I invite you to share your responses in the chat feature, but Gael, I'm going to actually ask you this question. So, as you think about your role at Talent at Work, really providing guidance and support on a global basis, as well as kind of in the Middle Eastern region, you know, how would you describe employee experience? Let's start off with that.
That's a very good question to start our conversation. And as we wait for our participants to put their thoughts in the Q&A box there, maybe I can share the thoughts that we have at Talent at Work. And I know that you're going to elaborate further more on it, Todd, but the way we see it as the employee experience, it is a journey, right? It's a journey that your employee takes within your organization. It's every single interaction that happens along that journey. It's every touch point that employee has within their employee life cycle. It involves an employee's role, it involves his workplace, it involves even his manager, and it also involves the well-being aspect of that experience, right? I think in terms of what does it capture at the end of the day, it captures everything that an employer can do to create really a very positive workplace experience that attracts and retains talents. That's our thoughts on behalf of the team at Talent at Work.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Gael. And, we're going to continue to, I think, look at answering this question. What is employee experience and how does that really relate to employee engagement? But let me again pause here for a quick moment to see if anyone joining us today would like to share a thought when you think about this term employee experience. And do you think it's the same or different from employee engagement? And I see a few people responding. The key difference between employee experience and engagement is that experience is input, whilst engagement is what you get as a result. Interesting. And that could be one absolute way to look at it. And as we continue on, I think we're going to see some different aspects about employee experience and employee engagement and see how this might actually be considered an evolution, if you will, when we kind of go beyond kind of the engagement activities. Because as we take a look at employee experience, we really think about this constituting the entire journey an employee takes within our organization. This includes everything from kind of pre-hire when they first find out about the organization to what we call post-exit and all the interactions that go along with it, along with everything that happens in between. So we might have to pause and kind of ask the question, so what does this really have to do with employee engagement and how does it all fit into the employee life cycle? And as we start off thinking about kind of employee engagement, out of all the interactions an employee has with the employer, we see a number of different pieces of research that identify oftentimes kind of 7 critical stages. And we kind of condense them down into the 4 high level ones that you see kind of on the screen here. Now, when we start to think about the majority of employees' time spent within our organizations, they kind of see 3 key areas. How do we engage them? How do they actually perform? And how do we continue to develop them? When we think about kind of what engagement is, we're really describing the basic psychological needs that have to be met in order for people to perform their work well. And this includes things like knowing what's expected and really having the materials that are needed. But it also includes oftentimes emotional and social needs, like the work that we're doing and the fact that we're good at the work we're doing. But we also have to connect our work to a higher purpose. We also recognize that Modern employer-employee relationships are complicated, and leaders have to continue to think about everything from culture to well-being to purpose and meaning, and truly make it all come to life in a personalized way for employees, both in person and oftentimes through digital channels as well. When we think about it, employee engagement alone is not enough to address all these aspects of the workplace, but they also can't be overlooked. We can spend a lot of money on things like internal branding, but if an employee has no friends at work, they're likely to feel disconnected from the culture, regardless of what we try and do. We can also do things like create beautiful office space, but if people don't see how they can grow, they're still likely to leave. One of the things that we also recognize that it may be tempting to really skip the obvious when we think about kind of the basics of what we offer our employees and focus on something more exciting. But as we think about kind of this opportunity to create an employee experience, leaders such as ourselves have to think about everything from culture to well-being to purpose and meaning, and again, make it all come to life in a personal way. Now, as we think about this a little bit further and continue this discussion around the employee experience journey, it really truly becomes what's oftentimes referred to as a long term redesign of the organization that puts people at the center. EX, or employee experience, is built on design thinking, where oftentimes organizations watch and observe and continually ask employees open ended, excuse me, qualitative questions such as what matters most to you? And all too often, when we look historically at engagement or even satisfaction, organizations oftentimes guess as to what employees are looking for. So we actually have to really ask that question, what matters most to you, and determine, does, factor X or factor Y, matter more, or we might discover that it's actually none of the above. When we look at organizations who really are pioneers in employee experience, they build and test prototypes of, employee journeys. And oftentimes it's simpler or similar, I'm sorry, to customer experience. And we might include things like a net promoter score. As we start to think about kind of this concept of design thinking just a little bit further, design thinking really places the issues of the employee at the center of the problem solving process and allows us to truly analyze the issues and solutions from their point of view, not the organization's point of view. And I think that's a key piece when we start to take a look at, truly how we distinguish employee engagement from employee experience. We're really looking at this from an employee centric perspective. When we start to take a look at building and testing prototypes of the employee journey in order to remove what's oftentimes referred to as pain points, so those things that get in the way of truly having the best experience, ultimately we're trying to elevate that experience and measure our success. We oftentimes see what we often will refer to as business centric metrics to measure success. Once again, things like a net promoter score or profitability or growth, but we also need to take a look at creating metrics that aren't tied to just a business outcome. And that's a key piece when we start to take a look at, the employee experience journey. And when we look at what some of those, metrics might be, those relate back to something I was sharing around well-being and purpose and meaning. Are we measuring those things? And that's oftentimes a key piece of the employee experience. When we look at kind of these measures in this journey, together these paint a picture of what employees feel most strongly about, with emotion being a powerful window into behavior that ultimately helps us understand to a greater degree employee experience. So I wanted to kind of pause for a moment and have you kind of reflect on what's happening in your organization today. So where do you think your focus is right now? Is it on employee engagement? Or would you say you've evolved to focusing on employee experience to a greater degree? And I invite you to share your thoughts in the chat feature. And Gael, I'll ask you this question as well. As you look at the work that Talent at Work is doing in the region and again outside of the region, where would you say most organizations are focused? Do you think it's employee engagement or employee experience or perhaps even something else?
No, I think, connecting with a lot of HR leaders from the GCC particularly, you get from both, right? The organizations that are at the forefront of leading in employee engagement initiatives really are looking at the bigger picture while still integrating employee experience while still integrating employee engagement. At the end of the day, they are intertwined, right? So I think we have very good examples in the region where we can see that. And as you can see from the chat there, almost everyone is responding, is saying that both of them are important. And I totally agree with them.
And I would agree with you, Gael. And there's some continued comments that are coming through. And thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts. More so, people are focusing on employee engagement today, and that's not uncommon as we take a look around the world. We've come so far to try and engage employees. Now we have to say to ourselves, so what do we do now to create this broader employee experience? And I agree that both are so important, and you're right, most of the focus historically has been on employee satisfaction and employee engagement. So this now gives us a new opportunity to take a look at, why we need to build a focus on employee experience, or oftentimes called EX. As we think about improving our employee experience, it truly does have a tangible and positive impact on our business outcomes. There's been a number of research, pieces that have been done, and one organization called Owl Labs found that companies that let people work from home experience 25% less turnover. Additionally, 9 in 10 workers report they're productive or even more productive when they work from a home office versus coming actually into kind of that traditional office environment. There is also, some additional research that suggests that, employees who say they're more productive truly are correct. They're usually 13% more productive than their colleagues and coworkers that are in more of a traditional office setting. And that's really driven by kind of their being happy in their roles based on their experience of having at least this flexibility, either on a full-time basis or a part-time basis, to do something as simple as remote working. We also recognize when we start to think about, being happy in the workplace, and that ultimately driving kind of engagement and then continuing to build on that employee experience. Engaged employees show up for work more often. And what does that mean? Well, showing up can be, related to productivity or performance, or showing up means that I show up for work and do my job. I don't call out. I don't, have excessive sick time and all those types of things. But we also recognize that, employees who are engaged outperform, by 22% when it comes to our organizations that have a greater focus, I'm sorry, on employee engagement outperform, their competitors by 22% with respect to profitability. In other words, what I'm actually saying is that motivated employees generate more business. There's also some additional research that was done by the Gallup organization that suggests that disengaged employees push customers away, so much so that companies with highly engaged workforces, have an opportunity to actually be less competitive by 1.5 times when you have a truly engaged workforce. When we look at, businesses and kind of this focus on employee engagement and employee experience, interestingly enough, there was a statistic that I was able to capture as I was, pulling this excuse me, information together, that businesses just in the United States miss out somewhere between 450 to 550 billion US dollars worth of productivity every year when workers aren't invested in their roles or the companies that they work for. So when you extrapolate that all around the world and continue to see that trend, we actually see it actually in the trillions of dollars. And that's really a staggering amount or a staggering number, and really starting to think about kind of how do we actually make this, more important. Now, if you've been to one of our earlier sessions this year, we talked a little bit about some trends. And, I wanted to bring us back to one of the trends that we talked about in one of our previous sessions with the Fahar group, which was reference to 2022 being the year of the employee. And, when we start to think about how do we create this year of the employee, it truly is needing a focus on employee experience. And I think one of the key takeaways here is that business leaders and HR teams have to prioritize employee well-being and empowerment if they hope to maximize business performance. And we anticipate the trend of needing to do that continuing well into 2022 and 2023. So as we kind of look at kind of some of the pieces that focus in on employee experience, one of the questions, that often comes to light in sessions like this or in the work that I do, or if people reach out to me after the session, which is absolutely fine, how do we build an employee experience centric organization? And I think one of the things that we have to start off with is that there's not a one size all definition to employee experience. And I think that's an important thing to know. When we start to take a look at studies and existing research and publications, there's not a standard definition of employee experience. And oftentimes, as you look at insight and information, there's not really an outline of the steps in designing an employee experience, or often sometimes called a playbook, because it's so important to take into consideration what's happening in an organization today. How do we look at the culture? How do we look at, the activities, the actions, the business structure? All those things have to be considered to define what employee experience will look like. When we start to take a look at, a couple of key things, not only do we have to create our own common definition and create our own kind of playbook or roadmap for success, we also have to understand, that this is a transformative experience, and we have to figure out what kind of transformation is going to be required. And that's a key piece. Oftentimes there's, cultural transformation that goes along with it, but we have to start to take a look at kind of what does that cultural transformation truly mean. As we think about this in designing employee experience, it's not really focused on what that matters. So, do we tick boxes of, 17 or 21 precise employee experience elements? It really focuses more so on how. Ultimately, we need to learn how to cook, but the best chefs go by taste rather than recipe. And we have to follow that same adage and that same format when it comes to creating employee experience. So we have to really figure out kind of not only what we're cooking, but how we're going to spice that food to make truly the best employee experience possible. Now, as we look at kind of this unique employee experience design, it also means that, from company to company and location to location, we might need to take a look at different aspects of creating an employee experience. And unfortunately, most organizations look at an employee experience approach holistically. They look at the workforce, such as, how many people we have, or sometimes our full-time equivalents and contract and temporary, or kind of what we might call agile workers. They'll look at everyone who interacts with the company, from recruits, new recruits, to people who have left the organization. And most definitions really talk about a holistic end-to-end journey and design the best possible experience for employees. But when we take a look at this, if we have different departments or different divisions or multiple locations, we have to take that into consideration as well, especially, if we have maybe different cultural influences in those locations, not necessarily country culture influences, but leadership culture as well. As we also think about another piece when we ask this question, how do we build an employee experience centric organization, or sometimes called an X centric organization? Oftentimes, as we look at companies who have successfully or been defined successfully as creating this eccentric type of organization, the most important reasons for building this again focus on things like business growth and engagement and truly creating that competitive advantage. But the challenges that we oftentimes see when it comes to building this eccentric organization are really the transforming of the culture, because we're making a radical shift to an outside in look. And all too often, we've historically looked at this inside outlook when we've created our organization. We also see a challenge being the leadership mindset. Employee experience pioneers oftentimes emphasize that the CEO or senior leader or leadership team at the organization have to be on board for employee experience to take place. We also start to take a look at just our organizations in general and how complex they are. And we have to start to focus in on simplification. That oftentimes produces the best employee experience. And one of the things that we have to pay attention to as well is that many times organizations who begin this journey lack the internal expertise of building employee experience, and they get stuck on staying at engagement activities. So when we think about kind of the successes and what we need to focus on, we need to have, senior leader or CEO support. We're really trying to achieve the goal of becoming a disruptor. If we're convinced that employee experience is the way to go, we have to disrupt all of our ways of thinking in order to gain that competitive advantage. And the experience that we're talking about, again, we come back to looking at this from the employee's viewpoint, first of all, is the centerpiece of cultural transformation. And it does involve many functions outside of HR, because employee experience is never just an HR only effort. It typically combines HR and marketing and IT and facilities, and the list goes on and on and on. So as we continue this question of how do we build, this eccentric type of organization, we start to take a look at, a number of different organizations that were researched by an organization called Kennedy Fitch to really start to take a look at, what mattered and what we needed to focus on. So Kennedy Fitch did a survey of 267 global organizations ranging from 500 employees upwards of 50,000 employees. And there was some really valuable, I think, information. And I wanted to share it with you today because I think it's a good starting point to help us answer a sub question to say how companies need to think about and use employee experience. And you'll see kind of on the slide here that 78% of respondents for that survey from Kennedy Fitch responded that building employee experience is important, very important, or extremely important for their organization for the reasons that we've shared. Again, either business growth or creating that competitive advantage or productivity or profitability. All of those were reasons why. 89% of the respondents reported that employee experience will increase in importance within their organization over the next 1 to 2 years. And this was a study that was done in late 2021, so very recent information. But as we take a look at this, I think this last statistic really reinforces the fact that this is a journey. It's not something that we just flick a switch for and employee experience just happens. We need to continue to stay committed to this journey. Now, another interesting piece when we look at kind of employee experience is making sure that we have technology that supports the actions that we're taking. And interestingly enough, in this survey, only 14% of respondents stated that their digital people strategy and their employee experience approach are fully integrated. So that's not allowing, the foundational pieces to be in place in order to make sure that we can truly drive, that well-being experience that's at the center of an employee-eccentric organization. And again, when we start to take a look at the three highest reasons why employee experience is critical to organizational success, we see again business growth, engagement, and a competitive advantage. So it's interesting. Now, as we take a look at, some other insight that was shared, when organizations began this journey, and many of these organizations began this journey that were surveyed in 2017, 2018, and very few had established employee experience practices. Only 6%, indicated that they had kind of some focus or some idea of what they wanted to do. Even as we take a look at, some interesting pieces, as I shared with you a few moments ago, it starts off with a common definition in the organization. And of these 267 organizations that were surveyed, only 15% had a definition of employee experience for their company, because it's been taking them a while to figure out what do we truly mean as we define employee experience. So I wanted to pause here again for a moment and maybe have you kind of think about this next question, and I'll invite you to share your responses in the chat feature once again. And the question is, where do you think we need to begin in building the employee experience? And Gael, maybe I'll turn to you once again to say, where do you think we need to start? What are some of the perhaps get ready activities that might be important that you see?
That's a very good question, and I'm eager to see what our participants and attendees think. But I'm actually going to quote here the head of HR for IBM, Diane Gerson. And she says on that particular point is that where do you need to start is before you need to do anything, you need to make sure that that process is co-created, right? And it involves other departments, it involves the employee themselves, right? So it's not something where you just do as an HR. It shouldn't only reside and sit with the HR, but it should also involve the entire organization from the leaders up to the employee himself or herself. But
Go ahead, Gael, please continue.
I see some feedback coming in from Leanne as well.
Yes. That there's some great feedback here. I see, start with employees itself, what they need, and then start with the plan. Leanne, you're saying you think organizations need to investigate how employees currently feel about this to identify gaps that they can improve. People are saying start with the employees. Maybe Fatima, you're saying when interviewing candidates, focusing on strengths and weaknesses, and again some continued messages of starting with the employee. So thanks everybody for sharing that. Gael, you were going to share something else?
We also have in the Q&A box some thoughts that are coming in as well. It's also revolving around that same point, right?
Yeah.
But I totally agree with our attendees. It starts with people and with the employee himself.
Yeah, and so when we start to think kind of where we start, I wanted to share with you some things that we need to consider. And many of you were saying it starts with people, but we have to kind of broaden our definition of who people are, right? So when we think about people, people aren't just employees. People can include our customers or suppliers or vendors or all of those things. So we kind of have to broaden that definition of where we start to gain that insight and understanding of what we need to do. So when we start to think about, when considering employee experience, we can actually broaden that. And what we're seeing in many organizations that have this focus on employee experience, it's actually kind of a broader experience that we take a look at, both customer experience and employee experience, because we're really taking a look at the people side of designing our organization to be more user-friendly, more interactive, more digitally based. All of those are things that we need to consider. So while it does start with, employees, let's broaden that definition to include different people aspects as well. Now, as we take a look at a few other pieces as well, when it comes to, a complete transformation, I mentioned before, we're talking about this radical transformation where there's completely, a new mindset and way of doing things, shifting to more outside in thinking and organizations designed around kind of the customer and the employee. And oftentimes having what we're doing for the employee mirrored to being what is done for our customers. We also have to start to take a look at, having a what we call a broad target audience. And what does that really mean? Well, we have to explore the experiences that people have had both inside and outside of our company, both perhaps those that are hired and those that aren't, and those that are full-time employees and those that might be contractors with our organization or part-time, as well as maybe consultants or alumni. We also start to think about how do we pay attention to the journey itself, not just the touch points. Employee experience, just like customer experience, takes a more holistic view of all the interactions or journeys an employee or customer has within a company or a brand. And these journeys include, but are not limited to, kind of what's oftentimes referred to as moments that matter. What are those truly moments that matter that make you pause and say, wow, this was a great experience? And we can take a look at what those are, both from a customer perspective and from an employee perspective. When we look at research showing, customers may score the overall journey somewhat lower than individual touch points, it's because we haven't packaged it together to say, overall, these are the things that truly matter. Now, when we start to look at this once again, you're going to see maybe a pattern here, some repetition, that we really need to define a unique employee experience approach. As we look at not only the 260 plus organizations that were excuse me, consulted for the research that I shared earlier, every kind of what's called an employee experience pioneer organization had their own unique definition for employee experience. When we take a look at GE or General Electric, for example, and the head of employee experience, Paul Davis, who helped to kind of pioneer employee experience in the GE organization, he defined it as enabling our people to do the best work of their lives through moments that matter. If we take a look at other organizations, we might see some different definitions to that employee experience, and that's absolutely fine and really quite honestly encouraged. Whoops. We also start to take a look at, two other pieces as well. The broad awareness, so that, companies recognize that people, also bring their work home and their home to work. Employees have children and maybe are grieving the loss of family members and going through other life experiences while they experience work. And this is leading to new and more humane policies and ways of working. And the final thing that we need to take a look at considering is really the stages to design. Rather than, again, a specific recipe or checklist, when we start to take a look at kind of what employee experience organizations typically go through, excuse me, there's several stages, once again, based on the design thinking concept. We include things like multi-channel listening and identifying holistic journeys and listening for emotion and doing things like creating personas so that ultimately we can design the experience we're looking for. Now, as we continue to take a look at kind of answering this question, and I wanted to share with you again some additional employee experience definitions, and you'll see a number of them on the screen here. Now, as we take a look at kind of the commonality in these employee experience centric organizations' unique definitions, we see that most definitions involve scaling design of the organization around the employee to really ensure the best possible experience. And some organizations add to this that their purpose is to enable the best work possible. They may also mention things like the holistic journeys and providing experiences that would increase innovation or development or performance and improve the customer experience, or a combination of all of those things together. So there's no one right answer in terms of designing an employee experience. But, as we take a look at kind of these final two pieces, the broad awareness, once again, and the stages to design, oftentimes people jump right to these last two to say, let's think about this and start designing. And they forget about kind of all the other pieces, the five pieces that I shared with you prior to getting to this design step. So when we start to take a look at what we need to focus on, I come back to the first point to say, it has to start with people, but people aren't defined just as employees. Now, as we take a look at maybe another question that I wanted to pause and ask, what challenges do you think you might encounter or might we encounter kind of, in general when it comes to, starting or continuing on this employee experience journey? And Gail, maybe I can ask you this once again, as you're working with a number of different clients focusing on employee experience in the region, what are some of the challenges that organizations have faced?
I'm actually going to pick up what Muhammad just shared on the chat, and I'll say this is one of the main challenges that we've noticed, which is the disconnect between an employee's expectations versus the employer's demands, right? And that is very important, right? Because if there's no clarity and there is no co-creation and co-participation in that design of that journey, then in this case, there's going to be a lot of issues that are going to face that project. To starting with when companies fail to listen to staff expectations about the workplace because they ignore the power of the feedback. So listening is very important. Engaging your people in that process is very important.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Gael. And so I'm saying, having a large number of touch points, I would agree. And that's why, as we take a look at this, some of the messages that I've shared already about starting with people and moving from kind of complex to simple approaches is so key and so critical as we look at, moving towards an employee experience approach. Now, as we take a look at this, there's a few challenges that I'll share with you. And again, please feel free to continue to share what you think might be some challenges in the chat feature. You're more than welcome to do that. But as we take a look at kind of employee experience pioneers, they've identified, the challenges that you see on the screen here as kind of the main challenges, when it comes to focusing on employee experience. When we take a look at, one of the key things, there's a need for changing the organization and really moving from kind of this hierarchical organization to a flatter organization. We also see when it comes to making some changes to the organization, we've also evolved roles, including what's historically called the CHRO role, the Chief Human Resource Officer role, to become the head of experience, not just employee experience, but experience in general. So we've combined that role with maybe a focus on the customer and the employee at the same time, because we're really mirroring what we're doing for each of those groups. We also see teams needing to become more agile across several different functions. So it's not just I'm going to stay in my silo or my lane of HR, IT, or marketing, but how do we actually cross-pollinate those groups to share great insight and information? That's really causing HR to be more integrated with other functions, especially again, marketing and IT and design and even facilities departments. So we're looking at this entire employee experience. Now, as we think about a few additional pieces as well, we also recognize the need for asking the question, are we ready for this? Are we actually focusing on the right things? And are we truly prepared to make this commitment to drive employee experience? It also means that, we might have to take a look at micro learning activities to help people understand in the moment, not just about employee experience, but it really changes the way we learn in an organization. And we talked a little bit about micro learning in our top trends for 2022. We also have to really have this great focus on performance management development. And what does that mean? It's really plotting out the future and helping everyone understand how they're aligned to organizational success and what the focus on employee experience will allow them to do. And I think, one of the other challenges that we oftentimes see is this collaboration, especially when we're starting to blend departments and divisions together and there's not a clear delineation of where one department stops and one department ends. So we see some of these challenges. And there was some commentary in the chat, Gael, and I may need your help to help me interpret the Arabic comment here. So if you would be so gracious as to do that for me.
I'm sorry, Todd, I don't have visibility on that. Maybe it's
On
addressed
the
only
chat,
for you or on the
uh,
chat.
on the chat.
I think
Oh,
it's.
go ahead, Gael.
I think he messaged it back in English. It was a typo,
There
a
we go.
typo in Arabic.
Yes, I just saw that as well. Thank you, Mohammed, for sharing. There's no worries, Mohammed. That's absolutely fine. That's why I have Gael here as well, just in case anyone's typing in Arabic, she can do some quick translations for me. Not only does she give great insight, but she does great Arabic translation for me as well. There was a comment here, work development plan should be clear to the employee in order for employees to have the experience. That's a challenge, and I would agree with you. Absolutely, I would agree with you. So as we continue to kind of ask this question, how do we build kind of an employee eccentric or eccentric organization? As we take a look at what's probably closest defined as what is a model or maybe a playbook or whatever you want to call it, I've shared that with you based again on some work that the Kennedy Fitch organization did, and really helps us understand what we need to do before we get started in terms of defining and mapping out kind of our own approach to employee experience. When we take a look at, the steps that we see here, or at least the first three steps, this is really the transformation to create an employee-eccentric organization. One of the things that we have to do is really shift our mindset. We then have to listen deeply and analyze insights, and that really gets us started. And those are kind of the three first steps. Because building an eccentric organization is so critical to our organization's success, and because the transformation impacts potentially the entire business, we want to make sure we really address kind of this leadership mindset to begin with. This is oftentimes the most frequently mentioned issues when we look at organizations who are kind of moving on this employee experience journey. Either leaders don't understand what they're doing or they can't get behind and support what we're doing. We also start to take a look at maybe not only listening deeply and analyzing insights, but we have to start to take a look at maybe starting with a non-traditional approach to problem solving. So if we, have just HR leading this, that's probably not going to help us. Maybe we look at a leader kind of outside of the HR function to help begin this journey. When we start to take a look at, a number of different pieces as well, we start to take a look at kind of really creating the employee experience and really continuing to start to take a look at not only understanding kind of those first three steps that I shared with you, but really starting to take a look at kind of mapping out kind of how we're going to gather information and what are those intentional steps that we're going to take from listening to identifying the journey to listening once again to creating personas of people that are going to work for us and know kind of how they're going to interact and relate and create this well-being experience so that we can truly design what matters. When we start to take a look at those journeys that I just referenced, those holistic journeys, oftentimes they focus on recruiting and onboarding and development and leaving and promotion and mobility and maybe, international expat assignments. But we have to look beyond that as well. So our approach isn't just what happens with our employees. Our approach is really how do we actually look beyond just the employee population? We also start to take a look at kind of what the future of employee experience or eccentric organizations look like. And we have to design the people strategy and capabilities. And you'll see here on the left-hand side of the screen, kind of that more traditional approach. And really, we have to start taking a look at, significantly changing the way we structure and operate. And one of the most prevalent changes that we have to take a look at is building a coalition of how other teams work together. So, really looking at things like design and facilities and IT and branding and so on, really kind of having either solid or dotted line reporting relationships into one another. Once again, we see the evolution of titles and position and focus. Once again, oftentimes the experience leader, maybe the chief experience officer, overseeing customer experience and employee experience. So we see kind of that consistency happening. Now, I want to pause here for a moment just to again maybe reflect for each of you and really start with the question that we see on the screen here is kind of, what steps do you think you need to put in place to begin your employee experience journey? And Gael, maybe I'll ask you kind of this question as well. As you work with clients again in the region, what are some of the things that you recommend, as some of those initial steps or first steps to help organizations begin to take, that critical first step in their employee experience journey?
Sure, Todd. I'm also eager to see what our participants have done in case they've designed their employee experience journey or what they are planning to do. But in general, the way we recommend uh, our clients is to start with segmenting their employees, right? Because it's not one employee experience across the entire organization. And afterwards, then the exercise of mapping out the interactions and involving the parties to be able to design that journey starts, right? So first things first is really segmenting your employees. But I would really love to know, what are your thoughts, participants? Please share your thoughts. We have Muhammad here. He says, first step is examine the vision and the mission of the organization. Absolutely. What is the scope? Wouldn't you agree, Todd, that the objective that this employee experience should
I,
support?
I I would absolutely agree, and I was just jotting down a couple of notes for some questions, just so I don't lose them here. But I would absolutely agree. This is really a holistic view of how the organization is going to operate, from the strategy to the mission to the vision to the values of the organization. And that's where we have to start. What's working well for us, what's not working well for us, and really, does taking the employee experience journey or starting the employee experience journey make sense for us now, knowing that just like any transformative journey, this can be a 2 to 5 to 8 to 10 year process. So it's not something that just happens overnight. So I would absolutely agree with some of the comments and your comment as well. Fatima, you're saying you need to ask for his or her thoughts on what they expect. And Fatima, I think you're referring to employees as well as part of that, if I understand the comment correctly. Mohammed, you're saying you'll do what you can, but in the end, it depends on the employee's ability to work. So you'll focus on their points of interest and develop them. And I think that's part of it, Mohammed. And I think you're raising a really interesting point, that this has to be a give and take relationship between the employee and the employer, but also any other people in that broader people category. So it could be customers and suppliers and vendors or consultants. All of those fall under that umbrella of people. So it's not just asking kind of about the employee, but it's really having those conversations with excuse me, other people to make sure that there's a give and take relationship. A few more questions have come in that or comments. The mission and vision and code of conduct. And Fatima, you were saying, yes, the employees. I would absolutely agree. And there was a question a little bit earlier that I didn't want to lose sight of from Adelia. You asked the question about, what do we mean by micro learning? Is that kind of distance learning or online? So the delivery of micro learning can happen in a number of different ways. It can be in person, it can be online, it can be distant. But what we start to take a look at from a micro learning perspective is really taking a look at relatively small learning units, or what oftentimes are called short-term learning activities. And we're really starting to take a look at kind of giving people what they need in the moment. If anyone is interested, Gael and I did the top 10 trends for 2022, and we actually focused on micro learning quite in depth, or a little bit more in depth, earlier this year. I think it was in March and April, Gael, if I remember those dates correctly. So I do encourage you to take a listen to that recording, because there was some interesting insight that we shared with micro, or in regards to micro learning. But thanks again for asking the question. Those are all the questions or thoughts that I see. So I'll just pause here for a few more minutes just to see, what other steps you may need to take to begin your employee experience journey. Other thoughts that anyone would like to share?
I'm actually going to respond to a question that I got from
Yes,
Amina
please.
regarding
Yes.
if it's possible to get the copy of the presentation. There should be no problem at all, Amina. We will supply it to the Fahar team. Please feel free to reach out to them later on afternoon or tomorrow, and I'm sure they can provide you a copy of the presentation. I
Thanks
think
very much, Gail, for that. So I know that we're probably at our hour of time, and every time we do these sessions, they go by so quickly. And I just want to say thanks once again for asking all your questions and sharing your insight. Gael, it is such a pleasure to have these conversations with you when we meet with the Fahar team to continue kind of helping to share insight and understanding about different aspects as to what we can do to really help our organizations be more successful. So with that, Gael, I will turn it over back to you.
absolutely. Thank you very much, Todd. It was a pleasure having you this morning, and thank you for our fantastic participants and all the engagement that we had. Great thoughts. Thank you, everyone who have shared their input. Please feel free to continue that conversation after that session. We look forward for your feedback as well through the Fahar team. And one more time, thank you a lot for the Fahar team for providing us that opportunity to share our thoughts on the evolving employee engagement to creating outstanding employee experiences. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely morning.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.